It began as an experiment in obedience. At least, that's how he justified it to himself. For years, the world saw him as a quiet intellectual, the kind of man who believed science could explain everything, even morality. He lectured at universities about human behavior, about how power and fear could change the mind. But behind that calm academic exterior, something monstrous had begun to grow, a curiosity that no ethical boundary could satisfy. He lived in Vienna during the 1930s, a time when the world was already trembling with the weight of coming war. His name was Karl Weiss, a respected psychologist who studied the mechanics of guilt. His papers were dense, unreadable to most, but his colleagues admired his precision. What they didn't know was that Weiss had begun conducting private tests in his home, experiments that blurred the line between study and sadism. It started with stray animals. He documented how long it took before a starving dog turned on another for food. Then gradually he moved to human subjects, people society wouldn't miss. Homeless men, refugees, orphans from the outskirts of the city. He told himself it was for science, that if he could measure the limits of obedience and pain, he could prove something profound about human nature. But what he really wanted was control. His basement became his laboratory. Concrete walls, a single bulb hanging overhead, and a large mirror where he could observe his subjects without being seen. He wrote down everything, their reactions to hunger, fear, isolation. At first he paid them, pretending it was a harmless psychological test. But when one of his subjects tried to leave early, Weiss locked the door and didn't let him out. That was the first time someone screamed in that basement. It wouldn't be the last. When the war broke out, men like Weiss suddenly found legitimacy. His work caught the attention of officers who believed in applied science for state efficiency. He was recruited, not as a soldier, but as a researcher. They gave him access to resources, subjects, and freedom from oversight. In his mind, this was his moment. He told himself he was contributing to the future. What he was really doing was constructing his own version of hell. The reports that surfaced decades later described horrors that defied language. He designed chambers where individuals were forced to obey impossible instructions, knowing disobedience meant punishment. He measured their responses to terror, heart rate, breathing, breakdowns. He injected chemicals just to see how quickly sanity dissolved. His notes were clinical, detached. Subject 14 ceased coherent speech after 27 minutes of exposure. He never wrote their names. When the war ended, the world began its desperate hunt for men like him, those who hid behind the mask of research while committing atrocities. Many were captured, tried, and executed. But not Weiss. He vanished. For years, people believed he'd fled to South America like so many others. There were sightings. A doctor teaching psychology in Buenos Aires, a man with his mannerisms living under another name in São Paulo. Nothing was ever proven. It wasn't until 1973, nearly 30 years later, that his name resurfaced in the most unexpected place, a small Austrian village, where a retired teacher claimed that her new neighbor, an old man with a limp and a thick German accent, spoke too precisely like a scholar. The teacher's nephew was a journalist, and curiosity led him to dig. He broke into the man's shed one night, hoping to find something harmless, maybe a clue, a document. What he found was a crate filled with old notebooks, their covers marked only by dates. Inside, the handwriting was identical to Karl Weiss's published work from the 1930s. Each page contained meticulous descriptions, not of academic experiments, but of people. Their names, ages, the duration of exposure, and the final note on each line. Result: complete submission. The journalist turned the evidence over to the authorities, and within weeks, the quiet old man was arrested. DNA and handwriting confirmed what no one wanted to believe. He'd been living among normal people for almost 30 years, teaching music to children, smiling at neighbors, attending local fairs. When interrogated, he didn't deny his identity. Instead, he said something that chilled even the most hardened investigator. "I never harmed anyone who didn't choose to obey." trial became international news. Reporters called him the scientist of obedience. He showed no remorse. He insisted his work was misunderstood, that he had merely explored the limits of human will. Survivors of his wartime experiments testified against him, describing the agony of being reduced to an object of study. One woman, now in her 70s, said she still woke up hearing his voice, calm, instructive, always asking, "Do you understand what obedience means?" When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts of murder and crimes against humanity, he remained motionless. The judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. He simply replied, "If I had not done it, someone else would have. I just wanted to know why people follow evil." He died 2 years later in prison, his notebooks confiscated but never released to the public. Rumor has it that some of them disappeared, sold on the black market to collectors of forbidden knowledge. Others claim the government still studies them, hoping to understand how ordinary men can be convinced to commit the unthinkable. Today, his name is rarely mentioned in textbooks. His official legacy has been erased, his papers burned. But fragments remain, photocopies, transcripts, whispers in academic circles. And occasionally, a new generation of students stumbles across his theories online, quoting him without realizing who he truly was. One of his most famous lines, written in an unpublished paper found in that crate, reads, "Evil does not begin with cruelty. It begins when obedience becomes easier than thought." She was born into wealth, and perhaps that was her first curse. The kind of family whose name opened doors, whose charity galas filled newspapers, whose estate on the outskirts of London was said to have hallways longer than some city blocks. Her father was a banker, her mother a socialite who collected art and people with equal enthusiasm. Their daughter, Evelyn Hart, was meant to be their masterpiece. Poised, brilliant, destined for refinement. But from the beginning, there was something different about her. Teachers said she was unnervingly intelligent. By 12, she could recite Shakespeare and solve complex equations, but she rarely smiled. Other children avoided her, not because she was cruel, but because she seemed to observe them, not join them, as though she were studying the way emotions worked rather than feeling them. Her parents called it genius. Her governess called it absence. By her 20s, Evelyn had graduated from Oxford with honors in psychology. She was striking, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but magnetic. People felt drawn to her, compelled to tell her things they'd never confessed to anyone else. She worked briefly as a counselor for trauma victims, but her colleagues noticed she rarely comforted anyone. Instead, she took notes, always asking, "How did that make you feel?" in a tone that sounded more like an experiment than empathy. It was during those years that she began what would later be called the Hart Sessions. Officially, they were private therapy groups for people with unresolved trauma. In reality, they were something much darker, gatherings where Evelyn explored how far people could be pushed in search of emotional release. Her clients came from all walks of life, artists, widows, soldiers, even a few high-profile politicians. They trusted her completely. She promised healing. What they got was something else. She believed suffering could be transformed into enlightenment, but only if the subject reached the absolute edge of pain. During her sessions, she used hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and, according to some witnesses, controlled cruelty. She made her clients confront their deepest fears, locking them in dark rooms, forcing them to relive traumatic memories, denying them sleep for days. And they paid her for it. They called her the healer of the mind. For a time it worked. Several of her clients claimed miraculous recoveries. One famous playwright said she saved his soul. But the cracks began to show when a young woman named Clara vanished after one of the sessions. Evelyn said Clara had left to find herself, but her car was still parked outside the estate. When police questioned her, Evelyn was calm, almost amused. "You think I hurt her?" she asked. "You don't understand." I freed her. A week later, a hiker found Clara's body deep in the woods. She was dressed in white, barefoot, and her face bore a strange expression, as though she had died in awe, not fear. The autopsy revealed she hadn't been physically harmed. No drugs, no wounds. She'd simply stopped breathing. The coroner wrote, "Possible psychogenic death due to shock." The police reopened the case, this time treating Evelyn as a suspect. Her clients refused to believe it. They swore by her methods, insisting Clara must have been unstable. But when investigators raided the Hart estate, what they found shattered the illusion of therapy. In the basement, they discovered a soundproof chamber with mirrored walls and a single chair bolted to the floor. The walls were covered with notes, phrases like, "Fear is the doorway to purity," and "A soul must die to be reborn." There were recordings too, dozens of tapes labeled with names. On them, Evelyn's voice could be heard calmly guiding people through what sounded like psychological torture, forcing them to confess, to scream, to beg for release. When confronted, she didn't deny any of it. She only asked one question: did they die afraid? Her trial drew international attention. The media dubbed her the Psychologist of Death. Her defense argued that none of her clients were physically harmed and that they had all given consent. But prosecutors painted a different picture, of a manipulative woman who played God with fragile minds. Several former clients came forward, admitting they'd been pushed to the brink of suicide under her care. Evelyn defended herself with eerie composure. "Pain," she said during testimony, "is the only language the soul understands. I merely translated." When the verdict came, guilty of manslaughter and psychological abuse, she smiled. Not out of arrogance, but something stranger, like satisfaction. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. While incarcerated, she became a fascination for psychologists and journalists alike. She spoke eloquently about morality, guilt, and consciousness. Some said she had the charisma of a prophet. Others believed she was simply mad. Her fellow inmates either feared or worshipped her. One woman described how Evelyn would talk people into peace, sitting with them, whispering until they fell into an almost trance-like calm. A decade into her sentence, something bizarre occurred. 3 inmates who had attended her meditation circles were found dead in their cells, all apparently self-inflicted. Each left a note with the same line written in perfect penmanship: "She showed me the truth." Evelyn was questioned but never charged. There was no evidence she had contact with them before their deaths. She was released early for good behavior after serving 15 years. No one knew where she went after that. Some say she moved to a remote island in Greece, others that she disappeared entirely. A few claim to have received letters from her, short, cryptic messages with no return address. One read, "When pain ends, so does self. I only helped them cross." To this day, psychologists still debate her legacy. Was she a visionary who misunderstood her own methods, or a manipulator who disguised cruelty as enlightenment? The truth may never be known. But one thing remains certain: those who entered her sessions never left unchanged. And sometimes, when new therapists open their practice, they receive anonymous mail, a plain envelope containing a single phrase written in elegant handwriting: "Fear is the doorway to purity." He was a name that once carried awe, not for his cruelty, but for his genius. Dr. Marchand, the brilliant surgeon who could save lives other doctors had already given up on. In the 1980s, his reputation in Paris was untouchable, a pioneer of reconstructive surgery, a darling of medical journals, and a man with hands so steady that colleagues joked he could thread a needle during an earthquake. He had everything: respect, money, and the quiet adoration of the medical community. But behind that immaculate mask of precision, Leon was hiding something unspeakable. It began with a fascination with perfection. He believed beauty was measurable, mathematical even. In interviews, he often spoke of symmetry as the ultimate language of nature. But in private, that fascination grew into obsession. He became restless during surgeries, his mind drifting from saving lives to shaping them. He began asking his patients strange questions. "If I could make you flawless, would you let me?" At first, it was harmless curiosity. He performed unauthorized enhancements during surgeries, subtle alterations that patients never noticed. But soon it wasn't enough. He wanted complete control, not just of the body, but of identity itself. His descent began after the death of a young woman named Isabel, a model who came to him for reconstructive work after a car accident. Leon restored her face, and the results were miraculous. But weeks later, she was found dead in her apartment, an apparent overdose. The police dismissed it as tragedy, but Leon knew the truth. Isabel had come to him after the surgery, in tears, claiming she no longer recognized herself. "You made me someone else," she told him. "I don't know who I am anymore." Her words haunted him, but instead of remorse, they ignited something darker. He began to believe he could fix not just flesh but souls, that through surgery he could perfect the human spirit. He began working secretly at night, long after hospital hours. He paid homeless people and drifters for experimental procedures. His clinic's basement turned into a hidden operating theater, sterile, cold, lit by a single surgical lamp. He recorded every session on tape, narrating in his calm, precise tone. Patient demonstrates asymmetry of the left jawline. Objective, realignment for aesthetic harmony. The results were grotesque. Faces reshaped beyond recognition, bodies stitched and rearranged like art projects gone wrong. When one of his patients was found dead near the Seine, the face unrecognizable, the fingerprints burned, the police took notice. They didn't connect it to Leon at first. Why would they? He was a respected doctor, the last person anyone would suspect. But as more mutilated bodies appeared, each with signs of surgical manipulation, detectives began to see a pattern. The breakthrough came when a nurse at his hospital reported hearing screams coming from the lower floor late at night. Investigators searched the premises and found a locked door that Leon refused to open. When they broke it down, they discovered his secret lab, the stainless steel tables, the tools, the cameras, and the walls lined with anatomical sketches. On one table lay a man, barely alive, his face covered with surgical gauze. When they removed it, even the officers recoiled. His features had been rearranged, the mouth shifted upward, the nose elongated, eyes unevenly sewn in place. Leon was arrested on the spot. The man on the table survived long enough to say only one thing. He said, "I'd be beautiful." The trial became one of France's darkest spectacles. The media called him the surgeon of God. Leon, however, remained disturbingly calm. He spoke about his crimes with the detachment of a scientist describing a failed experiment. "Perfection demands sacrifice," he told the court. "We are flawed by nature. I merely corrected what creation got wrong." Psychiatrists examined him and diagnosed narcissistic psychopathy. He saw himself not as a killer, but as an artist misunderstood by the world. He even sketched new designs for human faces in his cell, each one eerily symmetrical, each labeled with biblical names. He was sentenced to life in prison, though many believed he wouldn't last long. But Leon thrived in confinement. He became something of a legend among inmates, offering medical advice, treating wounds, and speaking of a coming new evolution. Rumors spread that he performed secret procedures on prisoners who wanted to become perfect. The guards dismissed it as gossip until one day a young inmate was found dead in his cell. His face bore faint, deliberate incisions, symmetrical, surgical. Leon denied involvement, smiling faintly as if proud. He wanted to see what beauty feels like, he said. He died years later, supposedly of a heart attack. But when his body was examined, the coroner found something bizarre. Surgical scars across his own chest and abdomen, self-inflicted. It seemed that even in death, Leon had tried to redesign himself. After his passing, a journalist obtained access to his notebooks, which had been confiscated as evidence. Inside were hundreds of sketches and reflections. One page, written in perfect cursive, stood out. "God made man in his image. I only tried to return the favor." The notebooks were never published. The hospital where he once worked was quietly renovated, and the basement sealed. Yet some staff claim that late at night they still hear faint metallic clinking, the sound of surgical instruments being arranged by unseen hands. And once every few years, an anonymous package arrives at a Paris art gallery, containing nothing but a wax sculpture of a human face, disturbingly symmetrical, and signed with 3 simple words, "Perfection lives on." She was called the Widow of Silence by the newspapers, though no one could ever agree on what was more chilling, her crimes or her calmness. Her name was Viktoria Danner, born in Munich in 1947 to a family that prized discipline above affection. Her father, a stern military officer, believed emotions were weaknesses to be trained out of children. Her mother, a pianist, was fragile and withdrawn, her music the only softness in that house. Viktoria grew up in a world of silence, the kind that presses down on you until your thoughts start making noise of their own. She married young, at 21, to a civil engineer named Otto. He was steady, mild, the kind of man who liked order and routine. Their life was neat. Dinners at 7, the same vacation spot every August, the same circle of friends. From the outside, they were perfect. But perfection, as it often does, began to crack from the inside. Otto fell ill in 1973, a strange, slow sickness that no doctor could identify. He became weak, his skin pale, his stomach constantly in knots. Viktoria was the perfect caretaker, never leaving his side, feeding him by hand, weeping softly during his hospital visits. But Otto never got better. In fact, every time he ate something only she had prepared, his condition worsened. When he died after 6 months of agony, the doctors chalked it up to organ failure. Viktoria wore black for a year and received endless sympathy from her community. Then she remarried. Her second husband, a banker named Eric, was the opposite of Otto, loud, confident, self-assured. He treated Viktoria with affection, but also with a kind of careless entitlement. He drank too much, flirted with other women, and often made cruel jokes at her expense during parties. Friends noticed that Viktoria would simply smile when he embarrassed her, saying softly, "Men are like storms. They always pass." But by their 3rd anniversary, Eric began to fall ill too. Same symptoms, same slow decline. He died a few months later, and once again, Viktoria was the picture of grief. The town pitied her, whispered about her tragic luck, her curse. 2 dead husbands before the age of 30. She bought a small flower shop afterward, a quiet life among lilies and roses. People said she found peace in it. For a while it seemed true. Then came the border. In 1980, a young university student named Lucas rented a room in her home. He described her as kind but distant. She often asked him about his studies in chemistry, seemed fascinated by the way certain elements interacted, how small changes could cause powerful reactions. Over tea, she once asked him, "Do you think a person can change their nature if the right balance is found?" He didn't know how to answer. A few months later, Lucas's mother reported him missing. Police traced his last known location to Viktoria's house. She told them he'd left suddenly for a new job abroad, but when officers searched her garden, they found disturbed soil near the greenhouse. Beneath it, wrapped in burlap and lined with flower petals, was Lucas's body. His cause of death, poisoning. Investigators searched her home and discovered a small cabinet hidden behind the kitchen wall. Dozens of glass jars labeled with strange handwritten symbols. Inside were traces of arsenic, cyanide, and plant-derived toxins. Viktoria didn't deny owning them. She claimed they were for the garden. As the investigation deepened, authorities exhumed the bodies of her 2 late husbands. Tests confirmed the same pattern. Both had died of chronic arsenic poisoning. Viktoria was arrested in silence, her face unreadable as the handcuffs closed. When asked why she did it, she replied, "Because they wanted peace. I only gave it to them sooner." The trial captivated Germany. The press called her the angel of quiet death. Psychiatrists couldn't agree on whether she was insane or simply devoid of empathy. She testified in her own defense, her voice low and emotionless. "They all wanted love, and love requires obedience. When they stopped being kind, I made them still again." She was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. But even in prison, her eerie composure unsettled everyone. Inmates said she spent her days tending to the small garden behind the cell block, growing herbs and flowers. She never raised her voice, never argued, never showed anger. One guard said it felt as though the air changed when she entered a room. Colder, quieter. Years later, a prison nurse wrote a memoir describing an encounter with Viktoria shortly before her death. The nurse said Viktoria had grown frail but still carried herself with elegance. One afternoon she offered the nurse tea, chamomile she claimed. The nurse declined politely, uneasy. Viktoria smiled faintly and said, "You've learned something most people never do. Never drink from a hand that trembles with calm." A week later, she was found dead in her cell, sitting upright by the window. On the floor beside her lay a small cup, half full. The autopsy confirmed it, arsenic poisoning. Whether it was suicide or one last experiment in control, no one could say. Her flower shop still stands today, run by a new owner who swears the air inside carries a strange sweetness. Locals leave flowers at the door every year on the anniversary of her death, not out of affection, but as a warning. The card they place beside the bouquet reads the same simple line, "For those who smile while they kill." He called himself the architect of pain, though no one knew that until it was far too late. His real name was Julien Moreau, a French structural engineer who built monuments that seemed to defy gravity, bridges that drew tourists from across Europe. But beneath the surface of blueprints and marble facades was a mind constructing something far darker. What he designed with steel and stone by day, he replicated in flesh and fear by night. Julien was born in Lyon in 1962, a quiet boy with an obsession for balance and symmetry. His father worked construction. His mother, a painter. Their home was filled with rules, every picture frame perfectly level, every tool put back in its place. As a child, Julien was fascinated with how things broke. He would dismantle toys, watches, clocks, just to see how each piece fit together, how one missing cog could collapse an entire mechanism. His teachers praised his precision, but there was something unnerving in the way he smiled when he spoke about destruction. After earning his degree in civil engineering, Julien moved to Paris and began working on municipal projects. His designs were immaculate, celebrated for their symmetry and technical genius. But coworkers often found him detached, too focused on perfection, easily irritated when others made small mistakes. "A weak foundation," he once told an apprentice, "can bring down everything, even people." It began quietly in 1991. A homeless man's body was found beneath one of Julien's bridges, bones broken in strange, deliberate angles. Police thought it was a fall. 2 months later, another man was discovered nearby, similarly posed, his limbs folded in unnatural symmetry. Both had been drugged before death. There was no connection between them, no motive, no suspect. Julien attended both crime scenes under the guise of concern. He even spoke with officers, offering structural insight. But privately, he was studying their response times, their habits. He viewed the entire process as part of a design, human behavior mapped like blueprints. The pattern continued for nearly a decade. Each victim was found near one of his projects, bridges, overpasses, or construction sites. Always arranged the same way, arms extended outward, legs bent at identical angles, faces turned toward the nearest structure. The press eventually dubbed the unknown killer the engineer. No one suspected Julien. He was charming, educated, respected. When interviewed about the murders in 1999, he told reporters, "An architect understands beauty through control. Whoever is doing this lacks discipline." In truth, Julien saw his crimes as a form of art. In a diary later found in his home, he wrote, "A bridge is only beautiful when tension is balanced." Humans are no different. Their breaking point is where art begins. His undoing came not through evidence but arrogance. In 2001, he began an affair with a young architecture student named Camille, 20 years his junior. She admired his brilliance but grew uneasy when he spoke about structural harmony in the human body. He would sketch her as she slept, tracing the lines of her arms, murmuring about perfect form. One night, Camille found a locked drawer in his study. Inside were dozens of photographs, crime scene images printed from news archives, overlaid with measurements and geometric annotations. At the bottom, a recent Polaroid, a man tied to scaffolding, still alive, his body marked with chalk lines. Terrified, Camille fled the house and went straight to the police. When they raided Julian's workshop, they found something that made seasoned detectives turn pale. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a series of concrete casts, human-sized molds shaped like contorted figures. Some were partial, others whole. In one, the imprint of a face still bore teeth marks in the hardened cement. Julian was arrested at a train station attempting to board a departure to Vienna. In his briefcase were photographs of unfinished bridges and a handwritten note. Symmetry requires sacrifice. During interrogation, he remained composed, even courteous. He denied nothing, explaining his actions as experiments in equilibrium. To him, each killing was part of a sequence, a way to test the geometry of endurance. When asked why he targeted strangers, he replied simply, because they didn't matter. Their imperfections made them expendable. The trial became one of France's most haunting spectacles. Psychiatrists described Julian as a rare fusion of brilliance and psychopathy, a man who saw the world as a set of mathematical problems, people included. He represented himself in court, speaking with the same calm tone he'd used at engineering conferences. He often corrected the prosecutor's terminology, saying things like, not murder, design failure. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict him on 8 counts of premeditated murder. He received a life sentence with no possibility of parole. But his story didn't end there. While imprisoned at Clairvaux, Julian continued drawing, not buildings, but people. Guards found sketches of cellmates posed like blueprints, lines measuring the distance between bones and tendons. One morning in 2008, he was discovered hanging in his cell. But the scene wasn't typical. He had arranged mirrors around the room, positioning his body so that in reflection, it formed a perfect geometric pattern. Arms spread, head tilted, legs folded, symmetrical, just like his victims. The guards refused to enter the cell at first. They said it looked less like a suicide and more like an installation. After his death, an unfinished manuscript was found hidden in his mattress. The title read, The Human Framework, Notes on the Mathematics of Pain. Inside were diagrams comparing the curvature of bridges to human anatomy, equations describing the limits of tension before collapse. The final page carried a single sentence, written in red ink. Every masterpiece needs support, and sometimes the support must break. Even now, some of Julian's structures still stand. Tourists cross them every day, unaware of the secrets buried in their design. That beneath the symmetry lies the blueprint of something unspeakable, something only the architect of pain could have built. They called her the collector, though she had never stolen a thing in the traditional sense. Her name was Margaret Ellison, a former art curator from Boston who turned her obsession with beauty into one of the most disturbing crime sprees in American history. What began as admiration became fixation, and what began as collection became possession in its purest, darkest form. Margaret was raised among canvases and classical music. Her father owned a small gallery, her mother taught violin, and their home smelled perpetually of turpentine and lilacs. She grew up believing beauty was sacred, something that separated the civilized from the monstrous. But as she got older, the lines blurred. By the time she was in college, she spent her nights alone in museums, sketching the faces in Renaissance portraits until her fingers cramped. She once told a classmate, "Some people capture beauty with paint. I want to preserve it as it truly is." She began working as an art conservator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, specializing in human portrait restoration. Her attention to detail was obsessive. She could detect brushstroke inconsistencies invisible to others. But colleagues noticed her growing attachment to the faces she restored. She would whisper to them, traced their outlines with her fingertips as though they were alive. "The eyes," she once said, "always remember who looked at them." Then, in 1997, a young woman went missing after attending a museum gala hosted by Margaret. Her name was Elise Carver, an art student and volunteer. Security footage showed her leaving the event alone, but witnesses claimed she'd last been seen speaking with Margaret near the staff entrance. Police interviewed Margaret, who was polite, composed, even helpful. She insisted Elise had mentioned a party elsewhere and offered the officers tea while they questioned her. No evidence linked her to the disappearance, and the case went cold. 3 years later, another woman vanished. This time, a journalist writing an article about the museum's private collections. Again, Margaret had been one of the last to see her. Again, there was no trace. It wasn't until 2004 that someone began connecting the pattern. A janitor who worked at the museum reported a strange discovery. In a locked storage room under renovation, he found a wall covered in oil paintings, all of women. But the paintings weren't cataloged in any museum record. When investigators examined them, they were struck by their realism, the skin tones, the texture, the eerily human quality of the eyes. An art forensics expert noticed something even stranger. Under ultraviolet light, traces of human tissue appeared in the pigment. Further analysis confirmed the unthinkable. The paint contained organic material, including human fat. Police raided Margaret's home that same week. Inside her basement, they found her private collection. The room was dimly lit, lined with easels and display cases. Each contained what appeared at first glance to be wax sculptures of women in serene poses. But closer inspection revealed preserved human remains. Skin meticulously treated, features arranged with surgical precision, eyes replaced with glass replicas. In the corner of the room was a half-finished piece. The body of a woman seated upright, face partially preserved, a palette knife still resting in her lap. Margaret didn't resist arrest. When officers entered, she simply looked up from her work and said, "Be careful. She's not dry yet." During interrogation, she spoke in calm, measured tones. "They wanted to be remembered," she said. "Museums forget. People decay. I gave them permanence." She described how she would select her subjects. Women she found aesthetically rare, often those who embodied features she considered classical: symmetry, grace, composure. She would befriend them, photograph them, and eventually invite them to her home for portrait sittings. What followed was a blend of chemical expertise and horror. Tranquilizers, embalming fluids, layers of treated resin and pigment. She never called it murder. "I preserved them," she told detectives. "Artists destroy to create. I simply followed the same principle." The trial in 2006 drew international attention. The courtroom was silent when prosecutors displayed photographs of the recovered artworks. Margaret watched impassively, even admiringly, as her creations were projected on the screen. When asked if she regretted anything, she answered, "Only that I wasn't able to finish the last piece." She was almost perfect. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with a rare form of psychosis rooted in aesthetic idealization, a compulsion to capture beauty before it faded. She was found guilty on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. In prison, she continued to paint. Guards said her cell walls were covered with portraits of faces she remembered, all of them serene, all of them beautiful. She signed each one M.E., her initials, and underneath a single Latin phrase, Pulchritudo per mortem mane. Beauty remains through death. When Margaret died of heart failure in 2017, a strange item was found in her personal effects. A small wooden box containing a single preserved human eye, perfectly round, perfectly clear. On the lid, she had engraved a final message: art should never be temporary. Even today, her surviving works are sealed away in government evidence storage. Curators who once worked with her refuse to speak about her, and museum employees say some of her restored portraits, the legitimate ones, seem to follow you when you walk past. The collector may be gone, but the faces she claimed remain trapped in silence, preserved forever by a woman who could not bear to let beauty die. He was known as the Butcher of Novosibirsk, though the name hardly captured the mind that hid behind that title. His real name was Anton Belikov, a quiet Russian pathologist who believed that death wasn't an end, but an experiment waiting to be perfected. His crimes would leave investigators speechless and entire communities haunted by the thought that someone so precise, so intelligent, could be so utterly devoid of conscience. Anton was born in 1959 in a snow-bitten industrial town deep in Siberia. His father was a surgeon, his mother a biology teacher. From childhood, Anton was fascinated by anatomy. While other children played with toy soldiers, he dissected frogs and birds, sketching their organs with startling accuracy. His parents encouraged his intellect, proud of his scientific curiosity, unaware that it came without empathy. He attended medical school in Moscow, excelling in pathology, the study of disease and death. His professors called him a genius with a scalpel, though they noticed a disturbing detachment in his manner. He once told a classmate, "The body is an equation. Solve it and you understand everything." After graduation, he returned to Siberia, where he took a job at a regional hospital as a forensic pathologist. The morgue was his sanctuary. He worked alone, often late into the night, surrounded by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the cold quiet of metal tables. It was there, colleagues said, that he began to drift. He became obsessed with perfection, the idea that human anatomy could be improved. Nature, he once wrote in a notebook later seized by police, makes beautiful designs but poor construction. It began subtly. A missing homeless man here, a vagrant there. No one cared enough to ask questions. But Anton was keeping records, meticulously documented notes of every experiment. He started by testing the limits of decomposition, learning how to halt it entirely. Then he began to modify. He would rearrange organs, reseal wounds with surgical precision, and attempt to rebuild his subjects in ways that no living body could survive. In his mind, he wasn't killing. He was reassembling. The first sign that something was wrong came in 1992, when a group of children playing near the riverbank discovered a human hand, pale, perfectly preserved, sealed with surgical stitches along the wrist. When police searched the area, they found several more pieces, all arranged carefully, almost ceremonially, in the shape of a circle. Over the next 6 months, more remains surfaced, each displaying the same haunting precision. It was clear the killer had medical training. Each incision was flawless, each dissection intentional. The media began calling him the Butcher, but those who knew anatomy saw something else, not rage, but artistry. The investigation dragged on for years. Then in 1998, a young medical intern named Darya began working under Anton's supervision. She was ambitious and curious, and Anton admired her for it. But soon, she noticed odd things. Reports that never left his desk, missing samples, late-night visits to the morgue long after closing hours. One night, she returned to the hospital to retrieve her bag and saw light under the morgue door. Inside, Anton stood over a table. On it lay the partially reconstructed body of a young woman, her skin restitched, her chest cavity rearranged, her face serene. Darya screamed. Anton turned to her, calm as ever, and said, "You shouldn't be here yet. She's not finished." Darya fled, and the next morning police arrived. But by then, Anton was gone. The morgue was spotless, save for one detail. On the stainless steel counter, carved into the surface with a scalpel, were the words, "Life is an unfinished design." A nationwide manhunt began. For nearly a year there was no trace. Then in early 2000, hikers near Lake Baikal found a small wooden cabin. Inside was what would later be called the workshop. There were 6 operating tables, jars of preserved organs, and photographs of victims pinned to the walls like anatomical studies. In the center stood Anton, alive and unarmed, wearing his blood-stained lab coat. He didn't resist when officers entered. He simply said, "You came too early." "I wasn't done." During interrogation, Anton described his crimes not with remorse but with the pride of an inventor. "You think I desecrate the dead," he told detectives. "But I honored them. I improved them. I removed what was flawed." He spoke of symmetry, of architectural anatomy, of a future where humans could be rebuilt to outlast mortality. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with a severe form of obsessive psychopathy combined with a delusional God complex. He refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, insisting he was misunderstood. "A painter uses a brush. I use a scalpel," he said during the trial. "Art and science are the same. Both demand sacrifice." He was convicted of 12 counts of murder, though investigators suspected the number was far higher. During sentencing, the judge called him a man who dissected not just bodies, but the boundary between genius and evil. Anton smiled faintly and said, "Boundaries only exist for the fearful." He was sent to a maximum security psychiatric facility in Omsk. Over the years, he became something of a legend among inmates, quiet, polite, unnervingly calm. Guards reported that he would draw anatomical sketches on the walls of his cell using crushed medicine pills as pigment. One day, in 2008, a nurse noticed he hadn't come for his medication. When they opened his door, they found him lying on the floor, eyes open, a faint smile on his face. He had used a broken piece of mirror to slice open his own chest, carefully, methodically, as though performing his final experiment. On the wall above him, written in blood, were the words, "Perfection achieved." After his death, authorities discovered dozens of unpublished notebooks hidden beneath his mattress. Thousands of pages of anatomical diagrams, formulas, and personal reflections. One line stood out above all others. "The body is only temporary. The design endures." Even today, the hospital where he worked keeps the old morgue sealed. Locals say the air around it still carries the faint scent of formaldehyde. And those who pass by at night sometimes swear they hear the echo of steel tools clinking in rhythm. The ghost of a man who saw beauty not in life, but in the silence that followed it. They called her the Mother of Shadows, though no one could quite remember when the name first appeared. Her real name was Eleanor Shaw, a midwife from small-town Kentucky, who, for over 2 decades, was trusted by nearly every expecting mother within a 100-mile radius. She was the woman who brought life into the world. No one imagined she was also the one who quietly took it away. Eleanor was born in 1943, the daughter of a preacher and a nurse. Her upbringing was steeped in prayer, propriety, and silence. Her mother taught her the art of care, the fragility of breath, and how to swaddle a baby before she could spell her own name. But her father's sermons planted something else, a belief that sin lived in the blood, that pain was purification. "Every birth," he used to say, "is God's test to see what a woman can endure." She became a midwife in her early 20s, a fixture in the community. Families adored her, gentle hands, soft voice, always wearing the same white apron embroidered with small crosses. Her reputation grew so solid that doctors often deferred to her judgment during complications. They said she had a gift for knowing who would live and who wouldn't. But that gift, it turned out, wasn't divine. In 1976, a farmer's wife named Ruth Miller gave birth under Eleanor's care. The baby never cried. Eleanor claimed it was stillborn. She comforted Ruth through her screams, buried the child herself, and refused payment. The family mourned, and life went on. But years later, when Ruth's sister gave birth under Eleanor's supervision, the same thing happened. No heartbeat, no sound. And once again, Eleanor insisted on handling the burial. Over the next 15 years, the pattern repeated. Dozens of unexplained stillbirths, all involving Eleanor. The local doctor attributed it to poor health conditions or bad luck. No one questioned her. In a town where people whispered their secrets through church pews, Eleanor was the keeper of the most sacred one, the boundary between life and death. Then came 1991. A young woman named Olivia Cooper, only 19, went into labor on a cold November night. She was unmarried, terrified, and had begged Eleanor not to tell her parents. Neighbors later said they saw Eleanor arriving at her home with her worn medical bag and a small wooden box. Hours passed, then silence. The next morning, Olivia's mother found her unconscious in bed, pale and weak. The baby was gone. Eleanor told her family the child had been stillborn and had already been buried according to God's will. But Olivia, when she woke, swore she'd heard her baby crying before she passed out. She told police, "I know he was alive. I heard him." An investigation began quietly. Detectives found no official death record, no burial certificate, nothing. When they questioned Eleanor, she remained calm, saying, "The Lord gives and takes. I only guide his hand." But her confidence cracked when they asked to see her home. She refused. They came back with a warrant. What they found beneath her farmhouse would become one of the most horrifying discoveries in Kentucky history. In the root cellar, hidden behind a false wall, police found over 30 small coffins, handcrafted, lined with fabric. Each contained the remains of an infant. Some bore faint signs of asphyxiation, others traces of sedatives. All were carefully preserved. In one corner sat shelves filled with glass jars. Inside, locks of baby hair tied with ribbon, each labeled with a name and a date. When confronted, Eleanor wept, but not out of guilt. "They were too pure for this world," she said softly. "I saved them from what comes after." During interrogation, she explained her calling. She believed the children of sin, those born to unwed mothers, addicts, adulterers, were destined for suffering. She called them tainted souls. To her, killing them wasn't murder. It was mercy. "The devil marks them early," she told investigators. "I just return them before he can claim them." The town was torn apart. Mothers who had trusted her were left shattered. Some refused to believe it. Others demanded her execution. Her trial was broadcast nationally, turning the quiet community into a spectacle. Psychiatrists labeled her delusional, driven by religious fanaticism and deep-seated trauma from her upbringing. Prosecutors, however, called her what she truly was: a serial killer hiding behind the cloth of faith. When the prosecution read the names of her victims aloud, Eleanor hummed hymns under her breath. When asked if she regretted what she'd done, she smiled faintly and said, "You cannot regret God's work." She was convicted on 27 counts of murder, though investigators believe there were far more. She was sentenced to life without parole, but prison didn't change her. She led Bible study groups, prayed over sick inmates, and referred to her cell as "my chapel." Guards said she'd whisper lullabies at night, the same ones she used to sing during births. In 2003, she died quietly in her sleep. Her last meal was bread and milk, and she left behind a handwritten note that read, "The children are safe now. Tell their mothers not to cry. They're waiting for them in the quiet." After her death, investigators revisited her property. Behind the farmhouse, near the woods, they discovered a small garden, dozens of white wooden crosses, some so weathered they barely stood upright. Each bore a date but no name. Locals still avoid the place. They say on windless nights you can hear the faint hum of a lullaby drifting through the trees. The same song Eleanor sang before each birth. The same melody she whispered before she took the breath she claimed God didn't intend to last. They called it the Glass Diner case, but that name barely captures what it really was: a descent into something grotesque, something that looked ordinary on the surface but hid a nightmare underneath. It began in 1964 in a quiet corner of Indiana, when a man named Walter Derry opened a roadside diner along Route 19. It wasn't much: 6 booths, a long counter, a jukebox that always seemed to play the same 3 songs. Walter was known as polite, if distant. His wife, Helen, was quiet, timid, always in an apron, always with a bruise she swore was from bumping into the freezer door. The diner was clean, too clean, some said. Walter had a habit of bleaching everything at closing time: the counters, the walls, even the salt shakers. The locals joked that he was more of a surgeon than a cook, but no one laughed when people started disappearing. The first was a trucker named Bill Harris, who stopped in one stormy night. He was a regular, known for his loud laugh and bottomless appetite. That night he ordered a steak and coffee, and then he was gone. His truck was found 2 miles down the road, engine running, door open, rain washing away his footprints. Then came Lisa Moore, a waitress who worked the night shift. She'd been planning to leave town, told friends she'd saved enough for a bus ticket to Chicago. On her last night, she never clocked out. Walter said she'd just quit and left early. Her uniform was found a week later, burned behind the diner. Rumors spread fast. Some said Walter had buried bodies behind the freezer. Others claimed Helen helped him, that she'd been seen digging at night with a lantern. The sheriff brushed it off as small-town gossip, until he went missing too. Sheriff Dan Rivers had gone to question Walter one evening after receiving an anonymous letter that simply read, "Ask about the glass." He entered the diner after hours. He never came out. A week later, the diner closed without warning. Walter and Helen vanished. The building sat empty, lights still on, tables still set, half-eaten pie still under a glass dome. For years it became a local ghost story. The Dairy Diner, people called it. Teenagers dared each other to break in. Most never made it past the door. It wasn't until 1973 that the truth began to crawl out. A new owner bought the building, planning to renovate it into a family restaurant. When construction workers began pulling up the old floorboards, they found something that made one of them scream so loud the police could hear from the street. Beneath the diner's floor was a crawl space, sealed off with sheets of reinforced glass, like a viewing chamber. Inside were remains, dozens. Some seated at makeshift tables, arranged like dinner guests, each with a napkin folded neatly in their lap. Their skin, or what was left of it, had been preserved with formaldehyde. Their eyes were open. Their jaws were locked in smiles. It was later revealed that Walter had been obsessed with taxidermy since childhood. He'd learned how to preserve animals with precision, later experimenting on larger carcasses. When he opened the diner, he brought that obsession with him. Investigators discovered that the special glass cleaner he ordered by the barrel was actually industrial embalming fluid. Helen, they learned, was complicit, but not willingly. Diaries found in the couple's home painted a picture of horror. She described her husband's belief that he could freeze time through preservation, that by capturing people in their happiest state, he was saving them from decay, from time, from the sin of dying. She wrote about how he'd make her serve them, the preserved guests, dinner at night, how he'd pour her wine and insist they toast to eternity, how the clinking of glass sounded like applause to him. The last entry in her diary read, "He says we'll join them soon," that he saved 2 seats under the glass. They found her body in that chamber, seated beside him, both posed at the head of the long glass table, smiling. The coroner determined they'd ingested poison, a final meal, a final toast. The cause of death was recorded as suicide. But what chilled investigators most was the final scene. Helen's hand clutched tightly around Walter's fork, driven straight through his throat. The diner was demolished a year later, but strange things kept happening on that patch of land. Construction crews complained of hearing clinking glasses beneath the soil, like faint echoes of cutlery on porcelain. One worker swore he saw reflections moving under his feet, even though there was nothing left of the glass chamber. Locals say that on foggy nights, if you drive slow past where the diner once stood, you can still see faint light flickering from underground, like candles illuminating a dinner that never ends. They called him the collector of still lives, though his real name was Samuel Ketch, a quiet man who lived in the outskirts of Vermont during the late 1980s. He wasn't famous, nor rich, nor particularly social. He was a local photographer, the kind of man who took graduation portraits, family Christmas photos, or headshots for hopeful models. His work was technically perfect but emotionally hollow, as if something in him had learned to mimic empathy but never quite feel it. For years people saw him as harmless. A little eccentric, maybe. He lived alone in a creaking farmhouse surrounded by woods. Children said they saw flashes of light through the trees at night. Camera flashes, rhythmic and constant, like someone taking pictures in the dark. In 1986, a young woman named Mara Linton disappeared after a local modeling session. Her car was found abandoned outside Ketch's property, but police found nothing inside his house, at least nothing that could hold him. He explained she had left hours earlier, and he didn't know where she'd gone. There was no body, no blood, no trace. 3 months later, another girl, Hannah Pruitt, vanished after booking a session for her art school portfolio. Then a third. Always the same pattern. Aspiring models, last seen entering Ketch's studio, never to emerge again. The police eventually searched his home, but what they found only deepened the mystery. Hundreds of photographs lined his walls, all meticulously framed. Each showed a woman sitting perfectly still, eyes unfocused, expression serene, almost lifeless. There was something unnatural about them. Their skin was too pale, their pupils dull and glassy. But Samuel insisted they were staged. "Art," he said softly, "still lives." He was polite, calm, almost proud. He offered coffee to the officers as they examined his negatives, as if this were a routine inspection. The officers left unsettled but without evidence. No one was missing in the photographs. No one could prove those women were real. Until one night a storm rolled through the forest and a fallen tree cracked open a section of Samuel's land near an old drainage tunnel. A hiker found it days later, a hollow space lined with plastic, filled with mannequins. Or so he thought. But the smell told another story. When police returned, they discovered over 24 preserved human figures seated in a circle beneath the house, bodies posed like sculptures, painted, waxed, frozen in time. Some were the missing women, their faces eerily identical to the portraits in his gallery. Samuel had turned them into his art. He used industrial resin and embalming fluids to harden the skin, maintaining their forms like museum pieces. Each was positioned mid-expression, laughing, smiling, weeping, as if he'd captured a single human emotion and made it permanent. When he was arrested, Samuel didn't resist. He only asked one thing: to bring his camera with him. "I want to document the moment," he said. In the courtroom, his demeanor was eerily detached. He described his acts in detail, calling them an attempt to stop decay. He believed beauty was a temporary cruelty that deserved preservation. "The moment you smile," he told the judge, "you begin to die." I only stopped the process. Jurors wept as photos were displayed. Victims frozen mid-laughter, as though caught between joy and horror. Every portrait had his signature lighting, a perfect balance of shadow and glow. It made the images mesmerizing and unbearable to look at. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without parole. Yet what haunted investigators most was what they found in his attic weeks after the trial. A single camera still on its tripod, facing a mirror. In the photograph inside, Samuel stood beside one of his creations, and she was smiling, but he wasn't. His face was blurred, as if erased by motion. Years later, guards at the prison where he served time reported strange behavior. Samuel never spoke to other inmates. He spent hours staring at blank walls as though framing invisible subjects. One night he was found dead in his cell, hanging by a camera strap, eyes open, expression neutral. But his last possession disturbed everyone. A Polaroid hidden in his mattress, developed days before his death. It showed a dim prison cell, empty, except for a faint silhouette standing beside his bed, looking directly at the camera. No one could explain how he took that picture. Which of these twisted crimes left you staring at the screen in disbelief? Each one reminds us that the darkest corners of history aren't always found in legends. Sometimes they're waiting just beyond the edge of reason. Tell us which story disturbed you the most in the comments below. For more deep dives into true crime's most chilling and unbelievable cases, make sure to subscribe, because here, where trust ends, the crime begins.